Clarum Decus demonstratur miseritus, quid Christus auctorium si mysticavit abstinens, hoc Moises capus Deo legis quedatur factus est.
Review of Thomistic Anthropology. In this part of our review of Thomistic Anthropology, or philosophy of human nature, we're going to go over the rational appetite, or the will. As we said in a previous video, there are several powers of the soul, or principles by which the soul acts. And these powers are the vegetative powers, the sense powers, the locomotive powers, the appetitive powers, and the intellect. The appetitive powers are themselves divided into the sensible appetites or sensuality on the one hand, and on the other hand the will, or the rational appetite. Now, we've already gone over the vegetative powers, the sense powers, the locomotive powers, and the sense appetite. Now we have to address the rational appetite, which is also called the will. The will is called the rational appetite, or intellectual appetite, because it takes the intellect, or reason, as its principle. As the concupiscible and irascible appetites follow the apprehension of good things by the sense faculties, so too the will follows the apprehension of the good by the intellect. Both the sense appetites and the rational appetite follow an apprehensive faculty, that is, either the sense faculties or the intellect, which apprehend things. Like the sense appetites, the will does not incline towards external things directly, but only to external things insofar as they are apprehended as good by one of the apprehensive faculties. The senses apprehend particular things, but not what it is to be good. They, for instance, apprehend this taste, and they apprehend it as good, but they don't apprehend what it is to be good, or what it is for something to have good taste. But the intellect apprehends goodness as such. Thus, whereas the sense appetites incline an animal to individual good things, the will inclines the person to good in general, the universal good. Now that we've seen the difference between the will, or the rational appetite on the one hand, and the sense appetites, or sensuality, on the other hand, let's look at how the will relates to necessity. Now, there are several kinds of necessity. The first is absolute, or natural necessity. This is from an intrinsic principle. Opposed to absolute or natural necessity is extrinsic necessity, which is from an extrinsic principle. But there are two kinds of intrinsic principles and two kinds of extrinsic principles. So, absolute necessity consists either in material necessity, which comes from the intrinsic principle of matter, or formal necessity, which comes from the intrinsic principle of form. For instance, anything composed of contraries is of necessity corruptible. This sentence expresses a sort of necessity, that is, the necessity of corruption. But the kind of necessity that it expresses is material necessity, that is, a necessity that is rooted in a material principle, or matter, namely, being composed of contraries. That's the matter of a certain kind of thing, namely corruptible things. An example of formal necessity is this. It is necessary that 3 right angles of a triangle equal 2 right angles. This is a necessity which follows upon the form or nature of the triangle. So it's the very form of a triangle that requires its 3 interior angles to equal 2 right angles. Now, extrinsic necessity is also divided insofar as there are 2 kinds of extrinsic principles, namely the end, or good, or final cause on the one hand, and on the other hand, the efficient cause, or moving cause. Now, an example of necessity from the end, or final causal necessity, which is also called hypothetical necessity, is this. If I cross the sea, I need to take a boat. Here, there's a certain end, which is thrown down, in Greek, hypothesis, or thrown down. And this end, or goal, is crossing the sea. Following from that end, by necessity, is the use of a boat. So here you notice that it's not the case that taking a boat is necessary absolutely, as with material necessity and formal necessity, but rather it's necessary in relation to something else, something extrinsic, namely a certain goal. If we are to accomplish this goal, namely crossing the ocean, then we must take this boat. So taking the boat is not necessary absolutely, but hypothetically, that is, on the hypothesis of a certain goal. If the goal itself is necessary, then so too will be the means, namely taking a boat. Here's another example. To survive, I need to eat. So the end here is survival. This is extrinsic to eating, but supposing, or on the hypothesis that we have the end of survival, then the means of eating becomes necessary. So these are examples of hypothetical necessity, or necessity of end. That is, a sort of necessity based upon the relationship of means to a final cause. Now let's look at an example of necessity of coercion, or the sort of necessity that follows from an efficient cause. Here's an example. Being decapitated, he died necessarily. So the dying necessarily is something that follows from the efficient causal working of the one who decapitates. So the decapitator causes necessarily the death of the person he decapitates. But it's not the case that the person died necessarily, except in relation to that efficient cause. So it's not an absolute necessity, rather it's a necessity in relation to something extrinsic, namely the efficient cause. So you see, we have four kinds of necessity: material necessity, formal necessity, necessity of end, and necessity of coercion. Necessity of end is also called hypothetical necessity. Now, both material necessity and formal necessity are instances of absolute or natural necessity. That's because they're based on the intrinsic principles of nature. And both necessity of end and necessity of coercion are called extrinsic necessity because they're based on extrinsic principles, namely the final cause or end and the efficient cause. Okay, so now that we've seen these four kinds of necessity and explained what they are through examples, let's look at how they relate to the will. First of all, is it possible for the will to undergo necessity of coercion? That is, can someone make you will something? Now, certainly someone can make you do something. They could take your body and move you to a certain action. For instance, if someone throws you off a building, they've certainly made you do something with respect to your body, but have they made you will something? That's a separate question. So, can the will undergo necessity of coercion? The answer is no. The will is, by definition, an inclination. As we saw before, it's the rational appetite. That is, the inclination following upon the apprehension of reason, or intellect. But coercion is a movement contrary to inclination. That's just the definition of coercion. That is, to move something contrary to its own inclination. Your inclination was not to jump off the building, and so when someone moves you to jump off the building by throwing you off, that is a movement contrary to your inclination. But since the will is an inclination and coercion is a movement contrary to inclination, the will itself cannot be coerced. So whereas your body can be coerced, for instance, when someone throws you off a building, your will cannot be coerced. because that would imply that you had an inclination contrary to your own inclination. That's just a contradiction. So necessity of coercion cannot be found in the will. Let's look at material necessity. Is there any material necessity in the will? Here too we must say there's no material necessity in the will. That's because the will is not material power. It is rooted in the soul as its subject, not in the composite of soul and body. And so, lacking any matter, it can't undergo material necessity. Now let's look at necessity of end or utility, also called hypothetical necessity. Can the will undergo hypothetical necessity? If you will some end, you necessarily will what you know goes along with that end. So, insofar as the will does incline towards certain ends, it inclines to what is good, and the intellect can observe that certain things are necessary as means to achieve those ends, then the will also be necessarily inclined to those means, apprehended by the intellect. As a result, the will can undergo hypothetical necessity or necessity of end. So this sort of necessity is the first one that we've seen so far, which actually can be found in the will. Now, let's look at the final kind of necessity, which is formal necessity. Again, this is a kind of natural or absolute necessity, which proceeds from a formal cause. Here, like in the last case, we see that the will can undergo necessity. Every nature necessarily moves to its end. For instance, rocks move downward. That's their end. And fire goes upward because it's the end of fire to be in a certain place above. The end of the will is happiness or the good in general. Thus, the will necessarily wills happiness or goodness in general. So, notice that this argument is based on the fact that the will is a kind of nature. So, just as the intellect has a kind of nature, and rocks have a kind of nature, and dogs have a kind of nature, and from these natures, certain proper activities follow. For instance, in the case of dogs, its nature results in things such as barking and wagging tails. In the case of trees, the nature results in growing upwards and sprouting leaves. And in the case of the intellect, its nature consists in activities such as knowing. So too, the will is a kind of nature. It has a sort of essence, or what it is. And according to this nature, it needs to have certain proper operations. Now, the proper operation of the will is to incline towards the good in general, which we can call happiness. Whatever the good in general is, the will is inclined towards that thing under the aspect of being the good in general. So it's naturally necessary, or necessary by natural necessity, that the will incline towards happiness, or things under the aspect of generally being good. So notice that the will is not entirely free from all necessity. It is free from necessity of coercion and from material necessity, but the will is bound by both formal necessity, which inclines it towards its ultimate end, and necessity of end, which inclines it towards the means which the intellect perceives are necessary for that end. Now, let's look a little more closely at what it means to say that the will is necessitated. That the will is not entirely free from all necessity, but is bound in certain ways by certain kinds of necessity. Now, the first kind of necessity we saw the will bound by was absolute necessity. Now, absolute necessity directs the will towards the good in general, which we call happiness. Now, as we saw on the last page, absolute necessity is the sort of necessity that, for instance, drives a dog to bark and wag its tail in certain conditions, and which drives trees to grow upwards as opposed to downwards. Absolute necessity is the sort of necessity that follows from an intrinsic principle. It's in virtue of what the will is that it necessarily inclines towards what the intellect perceives as good, that is, the good in general, or happiness. Now, it's important not to misunderstand what precisely this means. It, in some ways, is not much more of a claim than simply saying that the will wants what it wants. The will necessarily incline towards something under the aspect of being wanted or desirable. Nevertheless, it's not the case that the will is always necessarily inclined towards any one specific conception of what is desirable or wanted or happiness. For instance, misers think that happiness consists in money. Likewise, pleasure seekers think that happiness consists in pleasure. So the activities of the miser and the pleasure seeker and their acts of will incline towards very different things. The miser will incline towards money and hanging around banks, whereas the pleasure seeker will incline towards things that are pleasant, towards donut shops. So it's not the case that the pleasure seeker and the miser, even though they both have the same nature or will, it doesn't follow that they're both going to be willing the same sorts of things. But in some sense, they do will the same sort of thing, because both of them will something under the aspect of happiness, or being good. The miser is willing what he thinks happiness consists in. He's willing something that he thinks is good, namely money. So too, the pleasure seeker is willing something that he thinks is good, namely pleasure. So both of them are, in a sense, willing the same thing, namely what is apprehended by the intellect as good. Now, the second sort of necessity by which the will is bound is the necessity of willing those things which the intellect perceives are necessarily connected with what the will wills through absolute necessity. So just as the will absolutely, necessarily wills happiness, so too it will those things that the intellect perceives to be necessarily connected to happiness. You cannot say that you want to go to the opera if, when you find out what it requires to go to the opera, you choose not to go to the opera. So if you want happiness, and you perceive that something is necessary for achieving happiness, you must necessarily want that thing as well. It's the same principle. So there are two ways in which something can be necessarily connected with happiness. In the first way, we see something that is specifying the notion of happiness. So for instance, the miser specifies the notion of happiness with money, and the pleasure seeker specifies the notion of happiness with pleasure. They think that this thing, either pleasure or money, is the concrete reality in which happiness will be found. Now, if the intellect judges with necessity that a certain thing is the specification of happiness, then the will must incline towards that thing. Now, of course, the miser and pleasure seeker are wrong that money or pleasure is happiness. And so their intellect has judged falsely. It hasn't recognized a necessary connection between money and happiness. Rather, it's judged a probable connection between these things and happiness. But were there to be some necessary or certain indubitable demonstration that some one thing or some collection of things were the concrete reality in which happiness consisted, then the will would necessarily be inclined towards those things, or that thing, because the will would follow the judgment of the intellect about what is good, and the intellect judges with necessity. Likewise, not only is the will inclined towards what specifies the notion of happiness, but it's also inclined with necessity towards the means to happiness, if those means are necessary. So not always are means necessary. For instance, if I want to go to work, I could either take the bike, or I could take the car, or I could walk. There are multiple options. So no one of the means is necessary. So even if I necessarily will to go to work, I might not necessarily will to take the bike because I have another option, namely driving. But if there is only one means, or if the means is necessarily connected to the end, then that means is also necessarily willed by the will. This is hypothetical necessity, as we saw before. Although the will is bound by these two kinds of necessity, it's not the case that everything the will wills is willed of necessity. There is some freedom in the will, that is, some lack of necessity. The will is a rational appetite. Therefore, the will aims at good things not directly, as we've said, but insofar as they are apprehended by the intellect as good. So the intellect mediates between the will and external things. But the intellect is ordered towards knowing universally, or universals, whereas the senses are ordered towards knowing individuals. For instance, the intellect apprehends things like dog, triangle, and human, which have many instances. There are multiple dogs, for instance, there's Fido and Clifford, and there are multiple triangles. There's this equilateral triangle to my left, and then that equilateral triangle to my right. And likewise, there are many humans. There's Socrates, there's Plato, and there's Callias. So the intellect is ordered towards universals, that is, things which have multiple instances. In contrast, the sense apprehensive faculties, like the inner senses and the external senses, are ordered towards individuals, such as this particular dog right in front of me, named Fido, or this triangle on the whiteboard, or this human, Socrates. Socrates, Plato, and Hercules are all individual humans. They each instantiate the same common or universal notion of human nature. The will is necessitated with respect to the universal notion of good, that is happiness, and to what is necessarily connected with happiness, as we saw in the last slide. But the will is free with respect to individual things or universal things which have no necessary connection to happiness or the universal good. So, for instance, if you desire food, which is a universal notion, the will is inclined towards that universal, or put more properly, towards extrinsic things called food by means of the intellect's apprehension of that universal food as something good. Nevertheless, there are different species of food. For instance, there's hamburgers and there's pizza and there's broccoli. So the will would not be necessitated towards any one of those species so long as all the will is inclined towards is food in general, or the universal food. Likewise, if the will is inclined towards the universal hamburger, which is a species of food, then the will is still free with respect to which individual hamburger to choose. Suppose there's 3 on a plate. You can choose any one because all 3 instantiate the universal towards which the will is inclined. So it's indifferent with respect to the will whether it chooses the one on the right or the one on the left or the one in the middle. So there is a complex interplay of necessity and freedom within the will. Here's another example. If I know that eating in general is necessary for happiness, then I necessarily will to eat in general. This is the hypothetical necessity that we saw in the last 2 slides. But eating now or eating this particular kind of meal is not necessary for happiness. Thus I am free to eat now or not to eat this particular meal or to eat some other meal. This is just an example, but one thing that it illustrates is 2 kinds of freedom. There's a freedom of exercise, which is to eat or not to eat. That is, to exercise this bodily activity or not to do it, or to exercise this mental act or not to do it. On the other hand, there's a sort of freedom of specification, which is, if I'm inclined towards only this genus of things, this general category such as food, then I can specify that either with respect to any of its species, such as burger, pizza, or broccoli. So the will is free both with respect to exercise, to act or not act, or with respect to specification. So if it's inclined towards one end determinately, but that determinate end has many species, then it could pick which one of the species it's going to incline towards. So notice in all of this that freedom of will is perfectly compatible with the necessity of the will. That does not mean that the will is free and necessitated in one and the same respect. That would be a contradiction, because freedom is precisely the absence of necessity. Rather, the will is necessitated with respect to certain things, namely the last end or happiness, or the good in general, but it's free with respect to other things, namely those things not necessarily connected to the last end. Let's draw out the implications of what we said a little bit more in detail. Now, what we've concluded so far is that the will is necessitated with respect to 1, the last end in general, which is happiness, and 2, what is seen to be necessarily connected to the last end, either as a specification of it or as a means to it. But the will is free with respect to what is contingently related to the last end. Notice that this means that the will is incapable of willing things that are seen to be necessarily not connected to the last end. That's a lot of negations. Let me say it again. Necessarily not connected to the last end. So the will cannot will things which are necessarily not related as specifications or as means to happiness. Thus, the will can never will evil as such, since this is the opposite of what the will necessarily wills, namely goodness. The will can will things that happen to be evil, but it cannot will them under the aspect of being evil. For instance, if someone who is thirsty chooses to drink poisoned water, they will will something that is evil, but they will it under the aspect of good, namely as quenching thirst. Likewise, someone who commits suicide wills to harm themselves. They will something evil, but they do not will it as evil. They don't will to harm themselves as such. Rather, they will self-harm under the aspect of some good consideration, namely of removing pain. This is not, of course, to say that drinking poison or committing suicide is a good thing. It is an evil. Nevertheless, what is inclining the will is not the aspect of evil, but some aspect of it which is desirable or apprehended, falsely or truly, as good. Now let's make a comparison between the will, or rational appetite, and the appetites, by which we mean the sense appetites, or sensuality. The will is inclined towards what the intellect apprehends as good, and as we saw before, the intellect apprehends universals. Thus, the will is inclined towards universals. In contrast, the sense appetites are inclined towards individuals, or singulars, particular things. For instance, human, dog, and food are universals. These are the sorts of things that the will can be inclined towards. They're called universal because they're instantiated in multiple individuals, such as Socrates and Plato, both of whom are human. In contrast, things like Socrates, Fido, and this hamburger are singulars or individuals, not universals. Thus, these are the sorts of things that the sense appetites are inclined towards. But external actions, such as my kicking this soccer ball, are always individual. They're never universal. Thus, the will cannot cause the body to do anything directly. For the will to produce an action in the body, it must do so by means of the sense appetites or sensuality. So every single time that you move your body by your will, such as when you raise your hand, wave, or when you walk to work or you drive, in all of those cases, your will is moving the body by means of sense appetites. It's not moving the body directly. So if the will only moves the body by means of the sense appetites, we need to look at how the will, or the rational part of the soul, which consists of intellect and will, moves the appetites themselves. Again, as we saw in the last slide, it's only by means of the appetites that the rational part of the soul can move the body. But how does the rational part of the soul move the appetites? Now, this can happen in one of two ways, either indirectly, by thinking about something else, or directly, by preventing the appetites from moving the body. Let's look in a little more detail at both of these options. Here's an example of the first option. If your intellect thinks about food, your inner senses will be led to think about some particular kind of food. But the sense appetites are moved by what the inner senses apprehend as good. Thus, your sense appetites will be moved to desire food, indirectly by the intellect considering food. So your intellect considers some universal, that results in your inner senses considering the particular instance of that universal, and that leads to your sense appetites being inclined towards that universal, or moved away from that universal, if it's a bad thing. You can stop this desire by switching what your intellect considers. Instead of thinking about food, think about homework. Here's another example. Suppose a soldier is afraid of charging into battle because he is thinking about the feeling of being shot, the pain. He may be able to overcome this fear by choosing to think about something else, for instance, by imagining the battlefield not as a battlefield, but as a racetrack. By switching what his intellect considers, he switches what his inner senses are considering, and as a result, the emotion or passion which results from the apprehension of the inner senses is suddenly turned off. This is clearly a helpful technique in the case of fear. For instance, if you have to go on a roller coaster which you're afraid of, you can think about something else, not of the actual height of the roller coaster, and as a result, the fear will go away. Now, that is how the rational part of the soul moves the body, or the appetites, indirectly. Let's look at how it moves them directly. The sense appetites only move body parts by means of the locomotive power. Now, as we saw before, the locomotive power is what proximately moves the parts of the body, such as the wrist when you twist your wrist, or your face when you're speaking. That's all done by the locomotive power under the direction of the sense appetites. For instance, if you desire food, your desire moves the locomotive power to move your arms to reach out towards food. The will cannot directly turn off a sense appetite, directly make you stop desiring food. You can't, when you're hungry, will yourself to not be hungry, or when you're angry, merely will yourself to stop being angry. That's impossible. But the will can prevent the sense appetites from causing an external action. For instance, while still desiring food, the will can prevent this from leading to the hand to reach out for food. So here you haven't stopped yourself from being hungry, but you've stopped your hand from acting on that hunger. Here's another example. While still angry, the will can prevent the sense appetites from causing the fist to punch the object of anger. So again, you haven't willed yourself to stop being angry, you've merely prevented the anger from manifesting in an external bodily movement. So in summary, there are two ways in which the rational part of the soul consisting of intellect and will, can move the sense appetites. Either indirectly, by first moving the inner senses, from which the sense appetites are natural results or follow as a result, or directly by preventing the sense appetites from manifesting in some external bodily action through moving the locomotive power. Notice that in neither of these ways can the rational part of the soul simply stop the sense appetites from moving. You can't will yourself to stop being angry, or will yourself to stop being hungry, or will yourself to not have pleasure. All of these things are impossible, at least considered directly. Nevertheless, you could stop external actions from resulting from the emotions or passions, and you can turn off the passions or emotions indirectly by simply thinking about something else. Based on what we said on the last slide, there are two ways in which we're responsible for our own emotions. The first is, if you could have thought about something else but didn't, then you're responsible for the resulting emotion. This is the sin of morose delectation. For instance, if a child is told not to eat cookies from the cookie jar, he might excuse his breaking the command by claiming that he was overpowered by his strong emotions. His parents can then ask him, "Well, did you keep hanging around the cookie jar and looking at it?" If the answer is yes, then he himself is responsible for his desire being so strong. After all, he's been directing his attention towards the thing which he knows will produce the emotion which will lead to the external action of taking the cookie. Secondly, if you can't stop thinking about something, you can at least prevent the emotion or passion from leading to an external action. For instance, suppose someone has wronged you in a serious way. You try to distract yourself, but for a long time you cannot help but think of the injustice. So in this case, unlike in the last example, you're not able to think about something else because the thought is so powerfully impressed on your inner senses. Nevertheless, you can prevent yourself from acting on that emotion. If you kill the person, you are still blamed for the action that resulted from anger because your will could have prevented the emotion from controlling the locomotive power, which was the proximate cause of you moving your arm to stab them. This is despite the fact that the emotions in themselves are amoral. That is, they don't have any moral value, good or bad. So, as we saw previously in another video, if you simply have an emotion, that itself is not something blameworthy or praiseworthy. It's not praiseworthy to simply have the emotion of compassion, and it's not blameworthy to simply have the emotion of anger. The emotions in themselves are morally neutral. Nevertheless, insofar as they fall within the control of reason or the will, the emotions are something for which we are responsible, either blameworthy or praiseworthy. So if you will yourself to have compassion on someone, and this can happen by you willing to think about certain aspects of that person which cause the emotion of compassion to follow, then you are morally praiseworthy for that emotion, even though emotions in themselves are not morally praiseworthy. You're morally praiseworthy precisely because the emotion falls under the control of reason. So through sins caused by morose delectation or by a refusal to prevent the emotions from manifesting in external actions through the locomotive power, through both of those ways you can be held culpable for your emotions. The emotion itself isn't your fault all of the time, but the action resulting from it is. Okay, so let's summarize. So far, we've covered the vegetative powers, the sense appetite, the locomotive power, and now the rational appetite, or will. The only power we haven't discussed is the intellect.